Hello, all you big, beautiful brains out there. What prevents psychologists from diagnosing famous people? Today, we're talking about the Goldwater Rule. Before we get started, take a minute to subscribe to Psy vs. Psy. Help out your friendly neighborhood psychologist while I tell you all about the Goldwater Rule. You may have heard in a pretty famous trial currently going on, a psychologist talk about the Goldwater Rule. Let's go over what it is first, then we'll talk about how it came about and why it's still really relevant today. The Goldwater Rule states that while psychologists have an ethical responsibility to contribute to the improvement of a community and better public health, they can't give opinions about public figures who they themselves have not examined in person. It also says you can't discuss the mental health of someone without their express consent, but there are a few other sections of ethical code that also cover this, maintaining patient confidentiality. So really, when you hear the Goldwater Rule being brought up, it usually has more to do with the giving opinions on public figures part than the confidentiality part. This rule logically makes a lot of sense. After all, you wouldn't want someone diagnosing you with a condition or a disorder without ever having spoken to you in person. If someone tried to diagnose you just off stuff that you post, you could make a lot of wrong decisions, or say a lot of mean things. So many mean things. The Goldwater Rule is in Section 7 in the American Psychiatric Association's Principles of Medical Ethics. That means it specifically applies to clinicians, therapists, counselors, really just psychologists who can professionally diagnose. It is not part of the American Psychological Association's Code of Ethics. The American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association are two different things, even though you'll hear both of them referred to as the APA by the media. The American Psychiatric Association's Principles of Medical Ethics has other standards it upholds, like supporting access to medical care for everyone, respecting dignity and rights, and maintaining professionalism. Let me know if you want to see a video about the other sections, and we can make that happen. The Goldwater Rule is called that because former U.S. Senator and 1964 presidential nominee Barry Goldwater was the first public figure to be majorly impacted in this way by a psychologist. While he was on the campaign trail, a magazine called Fact asked a bunch of psychologists if they felt, in their professional opinion, that Barry Goldwater was psychologically fit to be president. Some psychologists answered, some psychologists didn't. But those psychologists that answered didn't pull any punches, calling him everything from a schizophrenic to saying that he was a mass murderer, and even comparing him to Hitler. The psychologists all gave their opinion even though they'd never evaluated Goldwater because there really wasn't anything at the time saying that they shouldn't. Goldwater probably lost a bunch of votes, and a court would later find in his favor. The American Psychiatric Association established the rule in 1973 under Section 7 to make sure that this kind of thing never happened again. So, why is this still important? When a psychologist gives a professional opinion, it's assumed to be from a place of authority. But psychologists simply cannot make appropriate clinical evaluations without standardized psychological evaluations and assessments. Psychologists need to gather data from those assessments the same way a medical doctor needs to take your pulse or your temperature. They can't make a proper diagnosis without having all the information. Announcing a clinical diagnosis without doing those tests would be like a medical doctor you've never seen for an exam diagnosing you with a deadly disease. In 2017, the APA doubled down on the Goldwater Rule, even expanding it to say any mention of a public figure, even casually, could be considered a violation. This could have been a step too far because now there are very vocal advocates against the Goldwater Rule. Many psychologists and mental health professionals are saying that in the era of social media, the Goldwater Rule is antiquated. Basically, that in the time of cancel culture, it might just be better to listen to a psychologist who might not have all the information on a person than to leave these kinds of life-altering decisions and comments up to the court of public opinion. They would argue that a psychologist has a right to free speech as much as anyone else, and that what they've been trained to notice about behavior could be beneficial to the public at large. So, that leads us to an important question. You've probably heard of famous figures or public people being diagnosed by pop psychologists with conditions like autism or OCD or being bipolar. Then they use those fake diagnoses of famous people to get views or followers. On this channel, we've even diagnosed a fake person with a disorder. We have plans to do videos exploring possible diagnoses on some other historical famous people. A lot of the conditions and disorders we now find commonly weren't even available as diagnoses in the past. So violating the Goldwater Rule might be the only way that we could ever get an accurate perception of who those people really were. So, we want to hear from you. Is the Goldwater Rule outdated, or is it critical to protecting public figures? Do you think psychologists' viewpoints could be beneficial when looking at politicians or movie stars, or people who think they're movie stars? If you want to see more videos from us about psychological ethics, ongoing celebrity trials, or random diagnosing of Batman villains from the 90s, make sure you subscribe to Psy vs. Psy so you can get all of our other videos and you can learn all about the science of psychology. Until next time, keep thinking, and I'll see y'all later. Bye! Remember, as we always say here on Psy vs. Psy, we don't diagnose our friends, but we maybe diagnose rich famous people from the internet.